So, today we're going to talk about boundaries in relationships, especially the relationship with your ex. Now, the term boundaries, I feel like, is a really broad term. What exactly does that mean? What is it? What are the benefits of setting boundaries? Are boundaries meant to punish somebody? Absolutely not. Boundaries are meant to honor ourselves. And those are not my words, those are the words of my guest. My guest today is Janine Marie Powell, a certified divorce coach, a pre mediation divorce coach, and the founder of her practice, SOS Divorce Coaching. Hi, Janine.
Hi, Jackie. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, so nice to have you. This is your first time on the podcast, and I'm excited to talk about this because when I hear the word boundaries, I can't believe I've been in business for 10 years and really never talked about boundaries as a specific topic for a whole podcast.
Mm.
And why is this so important? Like, what is the deal with setting boundaries in your relationships, especially with your ex? Why is it so important?
Yeah, and it is so important. And when you think of every other area of our lives, whether it's at work or in school or even at the gym or wherever we are, there's a certain code of conduct, right? But somehow we don't have that spoken about in our relationships. And I think many times when we look at marriages that ended up in divorce, a lot of times what was missing in those relationships were effective boundaries. And boundaries, like you said, when we set boundaries, and that word gets thrown around so much now, but what does that mean, right? Normally, we think if we're boundaries, we're punishing somebody else or barring somebody from our lives. And that's not the case. With healthy boundaries, like you said, we're honoring ourselves. It's a way of self-love, self-respect, self-care, self-preservation. And like I said, it's kind of, if you really look at it, guidelines for a healthy relationship, right? What are you going to accept? What's acceptable behavior and what's not acceptable behavior? And I think a lot of times as a divorce coach, I'm dealing with people who tolerated a lot of things that maybe they should not have tolerated in a marriage.
Well,
And
as you're saying this, I'm thinking about my marriage and thinking, wow, she's right. There were so many things that weren't appropriate, that weren't things
mm,
that I should have had to put up with. Those are boundaries.
yeah,
Boundaries doesn't just mean don't come to my house unannounced. Boundaries goes way deeper, and that's what I want to talk about. So, I want to tell my listeners a little bit more about Janine because this is important, especially as it relates to this discussion. Janine has been a divorce coach for several years, at least five, and she specializes in betrayal and narcissistic abuse. So, Janine, tell my listeners a little bit about your niche here so that they can understand. So, if they think they might want to talk to you, that you could be a good fit for them.
okay, yeah. So both of those things, what they have in common is sort of the disruption of reality, right? When you're we're blindsided by an infidelity or a betrayal, your world is instantly turned upside down, right? The person who you thought you knew and loved might not really be that person who you thought you knew so well, right? When you're confronted with something that you didn't think was possible. And similarly, when you're involved in a relationship with a narcissist, it challenges your reality because of all the gaslighting. So in both instances, it's more than just not having trust. You can no longer trust your partner, but you begin to not trust yourself and your own judgment because there's been so much lying, manipulation, gaslighting that it really shakes your perception of reality to the core. And in
Right. It's like you don't even realize it's happening. And then these boundaries keep getting pushed and pushed and
yes,
pushed more and more. And you're
yeah.
not even realizing that that's not normal or appropriate or acceptable behavior.
Right, right. And when you're in a toxic or dysfunctional relationship, you're often silenced because you know if you speak up or if something happens that you're gonna the story is gonna be shifted or it's gonna escalate into a huge argument. So how often we want to avoid an argument, so we just keep our mouth shut, right? So often in dysfunctional relationships, we're silenced. And another big key of any abusive relationship or dysfunctional relationship is control. It all comes down to who has the control. And by setting boundaries, we gain back some control, right? When we set boundaries, now we're in control. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what are we going to tolerate, what's not going to tolerate, right? We get to set the rules for how we're going to be treated, right? And we determine that. And so having boundaries can be really, really empowering. And if you didn't have them in your marriage, it's not too late. You can have them post-divorce, especially if you're going to be co-parenting and that person is going to remain in your life.
Well, it's so interesting because you just said that, and it reminded me of when I was getting divorced, literally 18 years ago. And my divorce mediator at the time said to me, your relationship that you had in your marriage is going to be similar in divorce.
Mhm.
Like if you were fighting all the time, you're probably going to be fighting all the time. But Janine, what I hear you saying is it doesn't have to be that way if you're willing to set boundaries and stick to them, because once you're divorced, you don't have to put up with it anymore. You're divorced, you're free. And so
Yep,
what you were willing to put up with in your marriage, or what you finally decided was not appropriate, it's important to try to change.
exactly. And that's it. In that relationship, you can break those old patterns. And it's not easy. It's not easy, especially if you're in a relationship where you're not used to setting boundaries. It can feel really awkward and uncomfortable when you first start doing it.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm so excited for this conversation. So I want to tell my listeners, Janine wrote this article for Divorced Girl Smiling, and in the article, it includes the 5 C's of effective boundaries, and that's what we're going to talk about. So let's start with number 1, that boundaries need to be clear. What does that mean?
Yes. So again, we hear that boundary word all the time, a buzzword. And like you said, well, what does that really mean? And we don't want to just set boundaries for the sake of setting boundaries, right? Declaring like, okay, here are the rules, right? They have to be meaningful. If we're going to stick with them and we expect people to abide by them, they have to be meaningful. So make sure, get clear in your own head what you want your boundaries to be. And where do you start? A good place is with your values. What do you value right now? What do you value? Is it your privacy? Is it your independence? Is it your sanity? Is it a sense of freedom? Is it peace? Is it calm? What do you value? And how can you protect those values? So that's a good way to figure out, where do I need to design, how do I design my boundaries? Design them around your values. And some of those things I mentioned, I think we value a lot when we're newly divorced.
Okay, so you talk about physical boundaries, emotional boundaries,
Mhm.
situational boundaries, intellectual boundaries, time boundaries, and communication boundaries. So, I mean, yeah, I guess explain just really quickly what each of those are. Because when I
Sure.
think of boundaries, I always think like, physical boundaries. That's what I think.
Yeah.
But
So a
there's
physical
so many different kinds.
Yes. Now, the ones I'm going to say are just examples, and obviously it can vary from person to person what kind of boundaries they think are effective. So, examples of a physical boundary could be I'm no longer sitting next to you at our child's soccer game. That makes me uncomfortable. Or when you come to pick up the children, I don't want you standing in the entranceway to my house. Please wait in the driveway. Or when we say hello, a simple hello will work. I don't want us hugging, or so those are examples of physical boundaries, which again, it depends on everybody's individual comfort level. An emotional boundary would be I'm no longer listening to your criticisms or judgments, right? Like so it's like saying no to those things, again, those disruptive or disrespectful comments or things that kind of trigger you a little bit, right? So I'm no longer gonna listen to your insults, right? So that's protecting your
So
emotional
as soon as you
well-being.
start insulting me and name calling, I'm getting off the phone.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. We'll talk when you decide to respect my emotional
Yeah.
boundaries.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Or
again,
like, stop asking who I'm dating. As soon as
mhm,
you do that, you are crossing an emotional boundary I'm not comfortable with. We'll talk later.
correct. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. What about situational boundaries?
Situational boundaries are just certain things like don't call me when I'm at work, or I'm not going to have this discussion with you when it's my time with the children, right? So certain things, or I'm not going to take a phone call after a certain time, or, things that protect your daily routines.
And also, like, I'm not going to respond to you if I feel like you've been drinking, something like
Mhm.
that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay.
It's a
All
good
right.
one.
Intellectual boundaries.
Again, when we don't feel comfortable sharing our beliefs or our values or ideas with anybody anymore, right? I'm not going to discuss with you who I'm voting for in the election. I'm not going to share with you my business ideas anymore. So again, we're protecting our beliefs and our values and our ideas.
Okay. What about time boundaries?
Putting limits on things, right? So I will talk to you on Monday afternoon. I put aside 15 minutes for that conversation. Or when you have the children, I want them home by 8 p.m. So we're
Okay.
protecting.
And then last one, communication boundaries.
Yeah, and that's to prevent like disruptions in our lives and to also protect our privacy, our safety and our privacy. So maybe I'm gonna ban you from all my social media, right? I'm not gonna follow you on social media, or I'm gonna not allow you to follow me on social media. Those type of things, that anything that could protect your privacy or your safety.
I just love this because do you realize? I guess my dog loves it too since he's barking. Okay, hold on a minute. We're gonna have to edit that out. Hold on.
Aw.
Okay. All right. So let's pick up, edit that all out and then pick up here.
Yeah.
So I
Another,
just love this because there are so many people listening who really don't even think this is an option, myself included. When I was getting divorced, I needed to listen to this conversation and hear all these things because I put up with a lot of um, disrespectful boundaries that I couldn't, that
Mhm.
I should have not, because I didn't really realize this. I didn't even think it was an option.
Yeah, yeah.
You're listening to the Divorced Girl Smiling podcast. My name is Jackie Pilosoff, and I'm your host. And today I am here with Janine Marie Powell, certified divorce coach who specializes in betrayal and narcissistic abuse. If you like what you're hearing and you want to contact Janine, you can find her at sosdivorcecoach.com. And Janine and I are talking about boundaries. We are specifically getting into the 5 C's of a bleh. We are specifically talking the 5 C's of effective boundaries. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we have 4 more C's of effective boundaries. Welcome back to the Divorce Girl Smiling podcast. My name is Jackie Pilosoff, and I'm your host. And today we are talking about setting boundaries in relationships, especially the relationship that you have with your ex. What you put up with in your marriage in boundaries can be changed. My guest is Janine Marie Powell, a certified divorce coach, pre-mediation divorce coach, and the founder of her practice, SOS Divorce Coaching. Okay, Janine, moving on to number 2 of the 5 C's of effective boundaries. Boundaries need to be communicated. So basically, once you know what your boundaries are, what we were just talking about are things that you can say to your ex and should say. Is that right?
Yes. And the important thing is, right, we have to recognize obviously that our ex is not a mind reader, right? So when we set these boundaries, once they're clear in our mind, we have to effectively communicate them. And there's a way to do that. We want to be precise, concise, and not do so apologetically, right? There's no need to say, I'm sorry, but this is how things are going to be, right? So you don't need to be apologetic. You don't need to give them a lecture. You don't need to rehash everything that happened in your marriage. You just simply state the new boundary. And you used one before that I'm going to use as an example, right? So the boundary, I am no longer comfortable talking to you about my private life. Our discussions will only focus around the children. Period.
Mhm.
Period. Right? We don't have
Now,
to open
Janine,
that.
do you find that people need to say this a few times before the ex actually listens?
Yes.
And you might have to say it every time. They might always,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe eventually they'll catch on.
Yes, yes. And that leads into our next point, right? So the
Yes.
communication, firm, direct, to the point, not apologetic, not over explaining yourself. The only explanation you need is that this is what makes me feel good, or this is what I need for my emotional well-being, right? But we don't need to get into all of that with our ex. We state the boundary. And the third C of effective boundaries are the boundaries have to have consequences. Because like you said, our ex is going to test our boundaries, especially if there were no boundaries in the marriage, right? This is new, this is foreign. All of a sudden, they feel like these rules are being imposed upon them. So they are going to push our boundaries. So our boundaries have to have some consequences. So again, referring to the same example, I'm no longer going to talk to you about my personal life. We're only going to have discussions about our children. And if your ex continues to ask you questions about your personal life, he or she is then breaking your boundaries. But more importantly, if you answer those questions about your personal life or whatever, you too are breaking your own boundaries, right? So it's important to be aware of that. They're going to break the boundaries, but you try not to break them as well, right? And making sure, again, that the boundaries have a consequence. If you continue this conversation, I'm going to hang up the phone.
What other
Action, consequence.
consequences? Like, can you say, if you continue in this way, I'm going to have to go back to using the Our Family Wizard app. We can no
Exactly.
longer
Mhm.
communicate. We're going to have to go back to using that app. Not that that's like a bad thing. Maybe,
Right, right.
it's a great thing actually, but maybe
Mhm.
that's part of a boundary.
Exactly. Or we'll no longer talk on the phone. We'll communicate only through email.
Yeah, and maybe, your ex is name calling and making you feel not respected. And so to avoid the name calling, well, we need to go back to the app, the Our Family Wizard
Mhm.
app. Now, this way, everything is on record, and then every judge or lawyer can see how you're speaking to me.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I love
One
it.
consequence, right? So it has to have a consequence. Yes.
Okay, now number 4, boundaries need to be consistent.
Yes. Now, again, the one beautiful thing about boundaries is it limits the amount of chaos and confusion in a relationship, right? Because it's clearly spelled out what's expected and what's acceptable. And to reinforce that, the boundaries have to be consistent. So if some days you ask me about my personal life and I'm like, nope, I'm not going there. But then 2 days later, you ask me about my personal life and then I tell you about it, there's no consistency there. And then when we have that chaos and no consistency, it always leads to disappointment, right? So being consistent is so important.
And you're so right. And one example I can think of is, let's say somebody is like, I'm not going to talk to you about my dating life. And then you and the person you're dating break up and you're devastated, and your ex happens to call at that time and you go, why are you crying? Oh, we just broke up. Oh my gosh. And you start telling your ex, then
Mhm.
the person is going to start asking you all the time again about your personal life. So call your therapist, call your divorce coach, call your friends, call your family, cry to them. But if you have set this boundary, you can't then go tell your ex, because they're just going to be confused and think the boundary no longer exists.
Exactly. And if you're consistent enough over a period of time, your ex will soon learn, okay, these things are non-negotiable, right? Here, like this, we mean business, right? This is non-negotiable. And sometimes it does take some time and some consistency before they recognize that.
It's almost like when you have kids and you're disciplining
Yes.
them. I mean, really, it's not that different. All right, I'm moving on to number 5, which is boundaries need to be celebrated. Explain that.
Yeah, I think that's such an important one because it is a brave thing to do and it is a hard thing to do. And we talk about these and give all these tips, but in reality, it's hard, right? We've been used to the relationship being one way for so many years, and now this is a major change, a major transition, and it feels a little awkward or uncomfortable, probably for you and your spouse. But recognizing that this is such an important step in your healing and in your growth and in, taking control and power back in your life and honoring yourself. Like we said earlier, right? It's a form of really self-care, self-respect, self-love. And I think that's always something we should celebrate.
Well, that is actually how I was going to end the podcast. I was going to go back to what it means to you to set boundaries, not you, Janine, meaning the person
Yeah.
who's setting the boundaries. But in narcissistic abuse or situations of betrayal, don't you feel like these women have such low self-esteem? They're afraid of the narcissist. They
Yeah.
might be so hurt and in pain about the cheating and the betrayal that, and so because of fear and hurt, they don't feel the confidence needed to set boundaries. And so when you actually do and you stand up to the person, as Janine says in the article and what she just said, you have to reaffirm and honor your self-worth. That is worth celebrating.
Yes, for
And
sure.
so, in closing, at the beginning of your article, you wrote establishing boundaries in relationship is ultimately a form of self love and self respect. So, explain how that is. The new rules, what are they doing for you?
Well, again, they're protecting what's important to you, right? Your emotional well-being, your energy, your time, again, because we're basing our boundaries on our values that mean the most to us, right? So it's putting ourselves first. And for so long, we think that that's a selfish thing to do, but it's really not. And when we start doing these and having our boundaries and standing up for ourselves, it opens so many more possibilities and opportunities. And we set the stage. And when eventually, if and when we're ready for a new relationship, we can use these same tools from the beginning, from the get-go in a new relationship, and you'll see how much healthier and how much better it feels to be in that new relationship when we're coming from a place where we're honoring our authentic self.
Okay, you were reading my mind because I was going to say one of the best things is when you get this self love and this self respect and you stand up to what you really believe makes you a healthy, really well person emotionally, you can then take those boundaries into a new relationship and you're not going to end up in that same pattern. Like in, somebody who was married to a narcissist could end up without doing the work, marrying another narcissist.
Yeah.
And because our subconscious is working against us, but if you do the work, and this is the reason I love divorce coaches, because working with Janine is going to help you realize that you deserve more. And then this is what you're going to take into your new relationship so that you don't fall back into those negative patterns.
Yeah, so true. And I just also want to add to that, it's not only in our romantic relationships, right? If we've been conditioned to be a certain way in our marriage, sometimes that spills into other relationships, right? Do you have effective boundaries with your kids, with your coworkers, with your friends, right? Are you able to, I mean, the simplest boundary of all is the ability to say no. Right. And are you able to, do that? And again, in across all relationships, being able to honor yourself.
Right. And do you feel like you don't want to disappoint someone, so you
Right.
continue to go out with these people who, maybe you feel are toxic and don't make you feel good, and maybe you're so busy
Mhm.
and you just want to sit home but you feel guilty.
Yeah.
Now, if you just love yourself enough to say, I'm going to do what I want to do, and the person's just going to have to deal with it.
Mm.
And you can be nice about it when you set boundaries
Yeah.
with someone. You can say, look, Wednesday nights really have never been good for me. I've done it because I know it's convenient for you. But now I just kind of feel like, is there any way we could switch to a different night? Even that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Being able to decline an invitation is big. And I just want to mention too, especially, well, for all of us, but especially if you've been in a toxic relationship or betrayed, one of the reasons why it's so hard to stick to a boundary is that fear of abandonment, right? If we say no, if we have these boundaries, people are going to abandon us. And so that's a whole, I mean, that's a discussion for a whole nother podcast, but recognizing and part of the healing process is recognizing that fear. What are our fears? What has held us back up to this time to create those boundaries? And like I said, a lot of times it comes down to that fear of being alone, that fear of abandonment, that fear of rejection. If I stand up for myself, or these people in my life going to leave me or reject me or abandon me. And I think
What do
that's
you say to people that say that to you?
yeah, well, think of that. Are those people who aren't respecting your needs, or are those really who you want to surround yourself with to begin with, right? The people who honestly love you are going to understand that the boundaries aren't about them, right? And it's more about the person who's setting the boundaries and their well-being, right? And
I love it. I love it. Janine, I could talk to you all day. You're a great divorce coach. I would highly recommend, if you like what you heard, reaching out to Janine. You can find her at sosdivorcecoach.com, and you can also find her in the trusted professional section of Divorce Girl Smiling. Janine, thank you so much for taking time to be on the show.
thank you, Jackie. This was great. Thank you.
And to my listeners, if you want to listen to more podcasts, find trusted, vetted divorce professionals, including Janine, read articles, sign up for my free consult. Sorry, I don't know why I'm spacing out. Or download my mobile app. You can find everything in one place, divorcedgirlsmiling.com. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and we'll talk to you real soon.